Hello and welcome to this Tuesday afternoon to Speaking About Speaking with me, Jackie Goddard, and my guest, who I'm going to bring up very, very shortly. But welcome if you're watching here live today. Please do interact. It's great to have your comments and questions. Anything you want to ask, then just stick them in the chat and I'll endeavour to answer them along with my fabulous guest here today, who likes to call himself, and he's just told me he came up with this as he was walking. He is the multi-story man. And Andrew Thorp is a speaker and a speaker coach, speaker trainer. But when he says multi-story man, well, I'll let him explain that to you. So welcome to the stream, Andrew Thorp. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Jackie. Great to be with you.
Lovely to have you here. I'll just swap you over on the screen there. So please explain, what do you mean when you say multi-story man?
Well, it's funny because I've been working partly in the construction industry in the last few years. So they often spell story in the way that I would want it to be spelt rather than putting an E in it. So I don't build multi-story car parks. I actually help individuals tell a more interesting story about themselves if they are representing an organization, if they're speaking on a stage, if they're being interviewed like this, or indeed if they're going for a really important job interview. They've got to tell an interesting story about themselves. So I suppose my mission is to help people to say something really interesting whenever they open their mouth in a way that absolutely connects with the audience and helps them stand out in some way.
Fabulous. I mean, we're on the same page here with stories. I think stories are really important if you are in whatever sphere you're in, whatever you are trying to communicate, either in a business world or in a social world, that actually you engage with stories. What is it for you that's really important about telling a story?
Well, I think one thing that's important is to define what we mean by it. I'll actually start with a story I shared on LinkedIn the other day, which is actually about a friend of mine. He's known as Mr. LinkedIn. So I'm the multi-story man. He's Mr. LinkedIn. And as the name suggests, he's called Mark Williams, and he trains people in how to use LinkedIn properly. And on his About Me section of his homepage on LinkedIn, he said that in 2008, he went to a networking event. Somebody asked him what he did for a living. He said, well, I'm a LinkedIn trainer. And the guy said, well, that's interesting. Do you do anything else? The implication being that that's not enough.
Yeah.
And I have a similar challenge in a way when you start using the S word with people in business who aren't necessarily working in marketing advertising, who obviously get it. They think, well, what do you do? I mean, do you just help people tell funny stories? Is that it? Do you do anything else? And I don't think of storytelling that way in business. I think of storytelling as how you frame a message. It's how you package a message in a way that really gets under people's skin and connects and moves them to act maybe in the way that you want them to. So it will be everything from a full-blown presentation is a piece of storytelling. Yeah. A pitch is a piece of storytelling. And a metaphor is a piece of storytelling for me. So it's not telling an anecdote. That's part of it. And I think if you're able to tell an anecdote, you can actually draw a lot of the lessons of how to structure an anecdote and apply them in other areas. But it is how you package the message you want to get across in a way so that it really connects.
Yeah. And so what is it within a story that's important to something like a presentation? Especially, I've spoken to people that are in engineering, or I've coached with people that are engineers, and they say, well, I've got all this data that I need to put across, and if they're not going to, I need to be able to get the layperson to understand, or what is it within an anecdote even that would make something that's quite data heavy relatable?
Well, I think when you're presenting data, you have to think of, well, why am I presenting this? What's the story behind the number? Is there one number on the screen that I can focus on and illustrate the overall point that I want to make, maybe through that number? So you help the audience focus on what they need to know. And one technique I heard during the pandemic, which I thought was really, really good, it was a podcast, I think an American podcast, probably The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast. It was 7 numbers that best illustrate what's happening to the economy because of COVID. So it would be about inflation, it might be about employment, it might be about demographics or whatever it is. That he chose 7 numbers that really encapsulated what was going on with the pandemic and how it was affecting the economy. That's a really nice use of storytelling, I think, using data.
Oh, yeah. See, that's confused me. What numbers are?
Oh, I can't remember what the numbers were. It would be what's happened to unemployment or what's happened to, the average price of a basket of goods in the supermarket.
Yeah,
So it was really clever way of selecting something that was representative of what was happening with the economy at that time.
Yeah. But you listen to a lot of podcasts, obviously, but you talk about, and you kind of, I've heard you sort of dissect anecdotes and people that are well known for their kind of storytelling, actors, celebrities that, are quite happy to just sort of sit back and recount tales and stuff. But you're very good at sort of picking those apart, aren't you? Where did that come from?
I've got a friend called Jeremy who does these extraordinary breakdowns of famous talks, and he hand draws them and he puts them on LinkedIn, and they're like a work of art. They're extraordinary. And I suppose Jeremy, in a way, was an inspiration for me to do a similar thing with something like an anecdote. So I actually did that with a story that Billy Crystal told. I think it was on the one of the late night shows. He told the story of how he was the host of the Oscars, and someone in the audience did something. I won't tell you what the story was, it's too involved to explain it here. But it was a really interesting story, and I broke it down and explained why I thought it worked, because it really worked beautifully. But he is a masterful storyteller. He's one of the very best. So it helps if the story's in good hands, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do you think is the key? I mean, what advice would you give? I mean, one of the questions that we discussed before we came on air is what is the best advice that you give? What do you say to people when they're putting together a presentation? Because you've done your own keynotes, and you are a speaker yourself. Where do you start, and what's the advice that you give to people if they're starting out?
I think if you're presenting something from the stage and you want to storyfy it, let's say you're presenting an idea to the audience, I think it's really important that you have some conflict in there. So the conflict at the beginning might be the problem that required you to think of the idea that solved it.
Yeah.
When did it raise its head? How did you first encounter it? And what was the process of discovery of coming up with the idea? And when you first put it out there, why didn't it work in the way that you anticipated, and how did you have to amend it to the point where it's now at? So it's gone through multiple iterations to the point where it now works. And then you maybe switch to the future and say, well, this is where I see it going. It's only working on a pilot level at the moment, but I think if we can embrace this and put it across the nation, it's going to make a real difference. So that's where I think you can start using some of these sort of storyfying techniques to make what could otherwise be a rather factual or logical pitch into something that's much more engaging for the audience. So that sort of conflict and tension, which you will know with your acting background, it's the basis of stories. If you don't have tension and conflict, you don't really have an interesting story.
No, quite right. But I think it's quite overwhelming, certainly with the people that I've worked with, if they have never had any kind of acting experience, certainly never any kind of performance experience, to think about how they can do that. They can actually go from saying, well, this is the message I need to deliver. This is what I want the audience to know. How do I start, and how do I take my audience on that journey? And
but I think you've got to start though by asking yourself, well, hang on a minute, who is the audience, and what do I want to say, and why would they care about what I'm saying, and what do I want them to think, feel, and do as a result of me being up here. And there was an example recently. I'll save their blushes by not saying who it was, but they presented on behalf of the Highways Agency in a part of the UK. Now, it was to a broad business audience, And the problem with the highways agency is they're on a bit of a hiding to nothing to begin with, because if they do their job well, no one notices. A bit like a football referee,
Yeah.
So they're invisible if they're doing well. And then as soon as the roads begin to flood or the snow doesn't get cleared, then everybody notices them. So they're on a bit of a downer to begin with. So I think what they had to do was to somehow create some empathy in the audience, to sort of empathize with the problem that they face in managing the road network and how difficult it is with things like climate change and with the uncertainty of freak weather conditions, and with increased road usage, maybe with more men in lycra on bikes now, and vandalism and budget cuts and all the rest of it. Generate a little bit of empathy and sympathy for the plight that they're trying to get through, and humanize their attempts to adapt to those difficult circumstances. And then I think they might start to win over the audience a little bit. But what they actually did was they presented factually and structurally what they did from an internal organizational perspective.
Yeah.
Using phrases like asset management. In other words, that was what they were looking after in there with the roads and the streetlights and so forth. And we wouldn't use those terms outside of their internal culture.
Yeah, and I think that's the classic. The word you used there that really struck home with me was humanize. And I think that's the thing. What's going on there is they're looking from the inside. They're looking. It's all about them. It's all about them as traffic. They're not doing anything that they shouldn't be doing, but they are not looking from their audience's perspective. They're not talking to the audience and say, look, I'm a human. This is my story. This will relate. You can relate to this.
Yeah. And I think if they were able to pick out maybe 2 or 3 individuals within their team who were heroes.
Yes.
Maybe Jeff, who he always wears a T-shirt no matter how cold it is. And he refuses to put a jacket on to keep him warm because he's got this sort of ready break glow around him all the time. That would be nice. It's a way of putting a personality on some of their heroes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, personality, another great word. Brilliant. I'm just going to cut to the audience at the moment. I've got my mum here.
Hello.
This is Dad worked with Billy Crystal.
So wow! Yes, fantastic.
Yeah, great man. And John Torrance. Hi, John. Nice to see you here. Jeremy Paul Waite. Is that who you were talking about?
Yes, Jeremy.
Yeah. So John is also a speaker coach from an acting background, and John is coming on very soon. So it's great to have John here. So I will put that in there because I'd like to see more from Jeremy as well. That sounds great. So how did it all start for you? What kind of background do you have? Because I meet people from varying backgrounds in this kind of sphere, talking to people about how they should show up for their audiences, how they speak in public, how they get that kind of confidence to go out there. Some come from an acting background, some come from a training background.
Yes.
Where did it start for you?
Well, obviously a golfing background.
Oh, well, of course.
What else would it be, Jackie? So I am serious. You know this. I come from a golfing background. So my brother's a professional golfer. I grew up in Lytham St Anne's in the northwest of England, which is a real golfing centre. So with those 2 factors, it was inevitable that I took up the game. And I got to a very good level as a youngster, but not good enough to turn pro like my brother did. But I always had a great interest in it. And I ended up after university working in the industry for 22 years as a referee, a tournament organizer. I used to coach golf to business people that didn't play but wanted to learn for networking reasons. So when I moved out of the industry around 2008-9, for numerous reasons, I had a difficult business partnership and other things that sort of went the wrong way. So I decided to reinvent myself. So the crossover between the world of golf and what I do now is public speaking, because in the golf industry, you have lots of prize presentations. And I used to like emceeing the prize givings. No one else wanted to do it. So I was able to sort of fulfill my frustrated actor thing and take the microphone. So I thought, well, let's go down the speaking route. When I left the golf industry. So that was the commonality or the bridge between the previous life and the current life. But I think it was through helping people to present better in business that I began to realize that they weren't doing justice to what they could be saying about their product or their organization. They were just sort of factually describing it, but they weren't telling a compelling story.
Yeah, it's about that show or tell, isn't it? And lots of people sort of don't understand that that actually just presenting the facts is not as engaging as it could be. And as you say, they're wasting opportunities to actually really bring people to them, to their business, to grow their brand.
They are. But I think there's some wonderful examples from, TED, for example, TED Talks. There's a guy called David Epstein, who's an American, I think he's a journalist, and he gives a great talk about athletics and athletic performance and whether athletes are actually getting bigger and stronger and faster, and he begins to question it. And one of the things he did is he showed, he talked about the 100-meter race. And we know that there's a very small difference in timings between first place, second place, third place. It's like a fractions of a second because of the speed that they're running at. But instead of showing it as a table with all the different times, he actually did it as a sound where there's a blip when people cross the line. So it was like, and that was the difference between first and last. And I thought that was really clever, to use an auditory thing rather than just a table of numbers. So I sort of steal a lot of these ideas from just being curious and listening to podcasts and watching videos and see if I can extrapolate some lessons.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a comment here from Simon Raybould, who was a guest in my last batch, who says some come from scientific background as well. And I know with Simon, he was a research scientist. And there's a lot of certainly from an actor's background, there's a lot of that kind of researching and looking into the motivation for a talk and the psychology around speaking that I sort of hope to bring to my clients. And it's certainly, within the characters that I played, it was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So is there anything in that you use when you're working with clients, that kind of sort of motivation research side?
I think one of the things that's really interesting is where you can talk a little bit about the psychology behind the behavior. So if you're talking about an idea to maybe influence the audience's clients or the audience's target market, to be able to understand not just what they should be doing, but why they should be doing it, because if you do this, this tends to happen. I think that makes the pitch much more interesting. So a degree of understanding of basic human psychology, I think, can really elevate what you're presenting from the stage. There's a lovely podcast actually called Hidden Brain, which I'm a big fan of. It's a podcast about, behavioral economics and psychology in general. And again, I've learned so much by listening to that about influencing skills and how you can frame a message in a way that is more likely to resonate and move people to act.
Yeah. Your podcast yourself, you host a podcast called Leaning Forward, and that's all about how you influence, isn't it? What's your tagline?
Of Leaning Forward? I don't know whether I have a tagline.
Oh, do you know what? So Andrew is one of the podcast hosts that I advertise within my own podcast. This is the three of us, myself, and Stefano. Yeah. And I suppose your promo is always in my head, and it's about we're all influencers. We're all in everything we do, whatever we speak, whatever we say. It's we're all in the influence game. Or something.
Absolutely, and it's a soft form of influence. It's not pushy, salesy. It's soft. I think it was the head of the Foreign Commonwealth Office once defined diplomacy as the art of letting other people have your way. That was a really clever line.
I like that.
So they think they're in charge, they're making the decision, but you just sort of influence them to go the way you want them to.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given as a speaker? Because obviously you've done a TEDx, haven't you?
I've done 3 TEDx's.
Wow.
Yeah. The first was 2010, which I struggle to watch because I don't think it's terribly good. I've got a bit better since then. And the latest was 2016, which I'm quite happy with that one.
Yeah. So, so what's the best piece of advice you were ever given as a speaker?
I think it would be do less, but do it better. In other words, strip things out.
Yeah. Yeah. It just sounds like it sounds like you've had a round of applause for that.
I know somebody was walking up some steps.
It was like, yay!
As I walk up those steps, it'll sound like people are applauding. No, I think it's a bit like in a script, where a script's a bit woolly and it needs to be pared down a little bit until it gets to just the right level. A bit like good copy.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one, because people that I've worked with that have kind of come in with everything, they want to fit everything into the 10 minutes they have to make this presentation. And actually it's no, the whole point of that 10 minutes is to start a conversation. You can't conclude everything within that 10 minutes. So I quite often say, right, well, edit and then edit again until you literally are down to the pure gold. I
think, if a company that you're representing does 10 things, don't tell them about all 10 things. You may list them, but perhaps choose 2 or 3 and go into them a bit more deeply and really storyfy them, do them justice. And the audience will love you for that. And if they're interested in one of the other 7, they'll come and ask you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the other thing, isn't it? If you've got too much in there, is that you end up speaking too fast. You don't take enough time. The audience don't get a chance to actually listen, engage, understand what it is that you're saying. If you don't, if there's too much information.
Exactly.
The number of times I say to people, just give them a handout. They don't need to know everything. All that stuff that you've got there, put it in a handout and email it to them. But what they want.
Sorry, Jackie, go on.
No, it's that whole thing of that quote. What's Maya Angelou? It's not how people won't remember what you said or how you said it. They'll remember how you made them feel.
Yeah, that's a lovely quote, isn't it?
So it's as long as you can do that in the time allotted.
Exactly. I was just going to mention that you're talking about speaking quickly. When I did that first TED talk, when you do a TED talk, there's often a countdown in front of you on a display. And if it's a full length, it's 18 minutes, it counts down. And halfway through, I panicked because I thought it was counting up. So I thought, oh my God, I've only got that amount of time left. And I started to speed up a little bit. And I think I finished about 2 or 3 minutes early because I thought it was going up and it was going down. But there you go.
So how scary was that first one? And how do you deal with the nerves then?
It was at Warwick University. There were some really heavyweights there. I felt like a complete fraud because I was quite early into this reinvention at that point. I hadn't really figured out my message. It's not a talk I'm overly proud of. It's okay, but it's not terrible. There was a Sir Robin Penrose, or Roger Penrose was speaking. He was a colleague of Stephen Hawking. He's speaking about the universe and the Higgs boson particle and all the rest of it. So I thought, well, what am I doing here? So I had to convince myself that I did belong there and had something potentially interesting to say. So I think I had sort of massive imposter syndrome, and I had a cold. I didn't feel very well driving down to Warwick. But I think in the moment you forget that you're not feeling very well and you just go into performance mode.
Yeah, the adrenaline kicks in.
I also walked up and down like a caged tiger, and I watch it now and think, oh, for God's sake, just stand still.
Well, that's why they've got the red dot, isn't it? That's why they've got that.
That's why they have the circular red carpet that you're meant to stay on. Yes, but I was nervous and I paced up and down.
So how did you get because I thought maybe a TEDx you only got to do the one. Does it matter on your subject? Can you talk about different things and go different ones?
Oh no, you wouldn't. I don't think you wouldn't do the same talk, but I mean you can still speak within your realm of expertise and do more than one. So that there are a number of people like Hans Rosling did a few because he was the great statistic talker. And he was a great hero of mine. So he did more than one. Ken Robinson did more than one. Brené Brown's done more than one. So you can do more than one for sure if they ask you.
Yeah, very true. Well, let's open it up and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask before we move on to to my next question. So if anybody is watching on the replay and you have a question that you'd like to ask either of us, then put it in the comments and we'll come and find you. We'll get back to you. So I have to ask then, Andrew, as I do with all my guests, is what makes a good speaker great and what makes a bad speaker suck?
I think some TED Talks, that they're at a certain level where obviously they're a very competent speaker because they've really practiced hard, but they look over-rehearsed sometimes. They don't look fresh enough. They're sort of so perfect that they seem almost unreal.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean by that, it doesn't seem like an authentic speaking from the heart about something. It's just too crisp and perfect because it's over practiced.
Yes. Yeah. I've literally had that with a client I was with this morning who was sort of saying, well, I've got 2 months. If I practice this every day for 2 months, I was saying, well, you know, there's a fine line, isn't there? There's a kind of a tipping point where you need to be rehearsed enough for it to feel comfortable and natural.
Yes.
But if you go too far, then it's almost like I always say memorize to improvise, because there needs to be a certain amount of it part of you and part of your body that you know it that well.
Yes.
And I know that as an actor, if you know it that well, it comes out as natural as possible. But if you go too far, then you end up just having memorized the words. And I think it's like music being overproduced, isn't it? Really?
Yes. You almost need it to be a little bit rougher around the edges.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit counterintuitive when people want their talk to be perfect because it's the thing that's going to be up there forever and I want it to be just right. Well, it's not necessarily going to be the best version if it's just too slick.
Yeah. So what do you advise people to do then so that they don't become over rehearsed?
I think you've probably got this skill more than any of us, and that is to be able to read something that's scripted in a way that doesn't sound scripted. Almost like you're thinking of something in the moment and then it's delivered. Yeah. Rather than it being a canned line that you've said 100 times before and it sounds like you've said it 100 times before.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's it. I think it's this thing about being your authentic self. And I know gets bandied about a lot, but it's, if you are being you, then actually it doesn't matter how many times you've told the same story, because it's your story and it comes from a place that's really authentic, then actually it's always going to be a little bit different because the lines are never going to come out in the same way.
No,
you'll never say them the same way because it's your story.
And I'd certainly advise people to watch the prize presentation speech by a tennis player called Lee Na. It's L-I and then second name N-A. She won the Australian Open and she gives a hilarious winner's speech that's so from the heart. I called it perfectly flawed. It was wonderful.
Well, that's, you know, if you can aim for perfectly flawed, I think that's the perfect place to be. Yeah. Simon in the comments here, let's just put this up. It says that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because what looks best in the room and what looks best later on a video on the TEDx website aren't always the same means of deliver, which I think is true, isn't it? Really. But then I think so many of us are not particularly. I mean, I found this as an actor is. I never saw myself on screen. I'd go on a stage and perform and come off at the end to rapturous applause, obviously. But it wasn't until lockdown really that I began to see myself on a screen.
Yes.
And actually what you deliver in your head and what you deliver on a stage and how that feels as a speaker and how that comes across to a live audience, I think is quite different when you're suddenly seeing it on a screen.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is we've all kind of got used to watching ourselves speak on the screen as we are now.
Yeah.
And I find it quite off-putting because I think, oh, my head's tilted to the side. I've got to hold it straight and I've got to sit up and my shoulders creased. I've got to do that. And it's a distraction for me. I'd rather be just in the moment and, you know, and speak to an audience. And, you know, if I look a particular way, I look a particular way. But you become a bit more self-conscious when you see yourself as you're speaking.
Yeah. But I've certainly gotten, I mean, I didn't particularly like most people. I would never, if I ever did, you know, I did a couple of short films and a couple of bits on screen, but nothing very much at all. But I always felt really awkward watching it back. I never liked it. I didn't like the sound of my own voice. But I have to say, over the last couple of years, I've gotten used to it. This is me, you know, and my podcast has always been visual, as you know.
That's what Mike Yarwood used to say at the end of his act, and this is me.
Ah, brilliant. Oh, wow.
For our younger listeners, that was he was a very famous impressionist.
Yes, I do remember him. Of course, I do remember him. Thank you to John. Again, there we go. That's the link for Lena.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Speech. John, can you come along every week? That would be marvellous. Thank you. And Simon, missing a Y at the end of that post. Oh, delivery. It was delivery, not Deliveroo. Delivery. Oh, well, that's brilliant, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here today. We have come to the end of our 30 minutes. Again, it's never enough to discuss this. But if you are watching now or you are watching on the replay and you've got any questions for either of us, then please do get in contact. I've got Andrew's website is here, andrewthorp.co.uk. And if you would like to listen to his fabulous podcast, Leaning Forward, that's where you find it. And also, what have I got here? Let me, brand. It's me playing with my, it's gone, there it is. This one here, Leaning Forward, some lessons from the actor world. So this is the podcast interview with Andrew that we did together for his podcast. And I didn't find the link to mine, but Andrew is also a guest on my podcast if you'd like to go find that as well, at Power to Speak, the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. So thank you, Andrew. That was amazing. That was so much information in there. I will put all of these links that John has very kindly put up here for me.
Great having John there to find all these these quotes and links. It's brilliant.
Yes, brilliant. Oh, well, thank you very, very much for listening and for watching. And I'll see you again next week. And Andrew, thank you very much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Jackie. It's great to join you. Thank you.
Speak to you soon.